My name is William Blackwood, though everyone just calls me Bill. This happened to me back in the spring of 1961, when I was working as a cave specialist and ranger at Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. I was 47 then, with 20 years of caving experience under my belt. What I saw down there, well, it still gives me nightmares. It all started with the strange tremors. Nothing major at first, just little shakes that made the coffee ripple in our mugs at the ranger station. Being a cave guy, I knew this wasn't normal for our area. Kentucky isn't exactly known for earthquakes, you see, but these tremors kept coming maybe 3 or 4 times a day, always seeming to get a bit stronger. Then came the call about the missing spelunking group. 5 people, all experienced cavers who knew these tunnels well. They'd gone in for a routine exploration of the lower caves but hadn't come back out. Their scheduled return time had passed 12 hours ago, and their families were getting worried sick. I remember sitting at my desk, looking at their filed route plan. Something felt off. These weren't amateur tourists who might have gotten lost. These were people who knew what they were doing. Tom Harris, their leader, had been exploring Mammoth Cave longer than I had. "Bill," my boss said, walking into my office that evening, "we need you to head up the search party. Take Jack with you. He knows the lower tunnels better than anyone." Jack Peterson was my regular caving partner, a tough old guy with a dry sense of humor who'd been my friend for the past decade. We'd been in tight spots before, but nothing like what we were about to face. That night, as I packed my gear and checked my equipment, another tremor hit, the strongest yet. The pictures on my wall rattled, and I heard car alarms going off outside. Something in my gut told me these tremors and the missing group were connected, though I couldn't explain how. I called my wife Sarah to tell her I'd be going down. She knew the drill. It wasn't our first rescue mission. But this time her voice was different, worried. "Bill," she said, "please be careful. Something doesn't feel right about this one." If only I'd listened more carefully to that worry in her voice. If only I'd paid more attention to the signs. But how could I have known? How could anyone have guessed what was really waiting for us in those dark tunnels, 2,000 feet below the surface? What we found down there wasn't just a new cave system. It wasn't just some accident that needed fixing. No, what we discovered was something that should have stayed buried, something that had been hiding in the dark for who knows how long. And now, after all these years, I'm finally ready to tell the whole story. But I warn you, what happened in those caves isn't for the faint of heart. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear them crawling. The next morning, Jack and I met at the cave entrance at 6 a.m. sharp. The air was cool and damp, and another small tremor shook the ground as we double-checked our gear. We had enough supplies for 3 days: food, water, extra batteries, first aid kits, and our radio equipment. Jack kept checking his watch, eager to get moving. "Something weird about these shakes, Bill," he said, adjusting his helmet. "Never felt anything like this in all my years here." We started our descent following the missing group's planned route. The first few hours were normal, just the usual narrow passages and wide chambers we knew like the back of our hands. But as we got deeper, things started feeling different. "You smell that?" Jack asked. About 5 hours in, there was a strange odor in the air, something like rotten eggs mixed with wet soil. We'd never smelled anything like it before in these caves. Then we found their first camping spot. Everything was still there: sleeping bags, food supplies, even a coffee pot with old coffee still in it. But no people. No signs of panic or struggle either. It was like they had just vanished into thin air. "Look at this, Bill," Jack called out, shining his light on the cave wall. That's when we saw them, the pictographs. Ancient drawings, but not like any I'd seen before. They showed strange, long-limbed figures with huge eyes, and people running from them. The drawings seemed to point deeper into the cave. As we examined the drawings, our lights caught something else, a crack in the wall that shouldn't have been there. It was about 3 feet wide, probably caused by the recent tremors. And there, on the ground near it, we found Tom Harris's notebook. "They must have gone through here," I said, picking up the notebook. The last entry was short. "Found new passage. Going to check it out. Strange sounds." Jack and I shared a look. We both knew what we had to do, but something felt wrong. Really wrong. The air coming from that crack was different. Colder, damper, with that weird smell getting stronger. I radioed back to base, found signs of the missing group. Following new passage, possibly opened by recent seismic activity. We'll update every hour. As we squeezed through the crack, our lights showed a tunnel that wasn't on any of our maps. The walls were different here, smoother, almost polished looking, and the ground had strange marks on it, like something had been dragged across it. Many things. That's when we heard it, a sound that made us both freeze. It wasn't the usual drip of water or echo of our movements. No, this was something else. Something that sounded almost like singing, but not quite. It was more like a humming that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Jack grabbed my arm. "Bill," he whispered, "maybe we should." Before he could finish, another tremor hit, stronger than any before. Rocks fell around us, and our lights flickered. When they steadied again, we saw something that made my blood run cold, a perfect handprint on the cave wall. But it wasn't human. The fingers were too long, too thin, and it looked fresh. We were no longer alone in these caves, and whatever was down here with us, it knew we were coming. The deeper we went, the stranger things got. Our lights started acting funny, sometimes getting dim, then suddenly bright, even though we had fresh batteries. The humming sound grew louder, and it made my head feel weird, like I was dizzy. "Bill," Jack whispered, "look there." His light beam showed something shiny on the ground. It was a camera belonging to Lisa, one of the missing cavers. The lens was cracked, but the memory card was intact. Then we heard it, a scraping sound, like nails on rock, coming from somewhere ahead of us. Jack and I switched off our lights immediately. Years of caving taught us sometimes darkness is your friend. In the pitch black, we heard something moving, not walking, more like, sliding across the walls. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure whatever it was could hear it. Then came a sound I'll never forget, a soft clicking, like someone tapping their teeth together. I slowly turned my light back on, keeping it pointed down. That's when I saw them, feet, just at the edge of my light beam. But they weren't human feet. They were long, pale, almost see-through, with toes that looked more like fingers. My light beam moved up, and I saw it, the creature. It was human-shaped, but wrong in every way. Tall and thin, with skin you could almost see through, like a cave fish. Its eyes were huge, milky white, and it had no hair. Its hands, its hands had fingers twice as long as they should be, with sharp, claw-like nails. The creature's head snapped toward us, those white eyes fixing on our position. Then it opened its mouth, too wide, impossibly wide, and let out a sound that made my vision blur. It wasn't loud, but it felt like it was inside my head, making everything spin. "Run!" I screamed, but Jack was already moving. We bolted back the way we came, but the tunnel looked different somehow. The creature was fast, too fast. We could hear it moving on the walls, on the ceiling, always just behind us. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in a large chamber. Our lights showed more tunnels leading off in different directions. But what made us stop dead in our tracks was what we saw on the walls, more creatures, clinging to the rock like spiders, all turning to look at us. "This way," Jack yelled, pulling me toward one of the tunnels. But as we ran, the humming got louder, and my head felt like it was going to explode. The creatures were doing something with the sound, using it like a weapon. I stumbled, my balance completely gone. Jack grabbed my arm, keeping me upright. "Don't listen to it," he shouted. "Just run." But we both knew we were in serious trouble. These things, whatever they were, this was their home. They knew every tunnel, every passage, and worse, they were hunting us. Through my spinning vision, I saw something that made my stomach turn. A familiar backpack caught on a rock. It belonged to Tom Harris, and it was covered in what looked like claw marks. We weren't just looking for missing Cavers anymore. We were running for our lives. We ran until our lungs burned. Finally, we found a small side tunnel and squeezed into it, trying to catch our breath. The clicking sound seemed to have faded, but the humming was still there, like a headache you can't shake off. "Bill," Jack whispered, his voice shaking, "we need to find those people and get out of here." That's when we smelled it. That awful smell from before, but 100 times worse. Our lights showed another chamber ahead. I wish we'd never looked inside. The chamber was like a nightmare come true. There, hanging from the ceiling like cocoons, were people. Some were the missing Cavers, but others. God, there were so many others. Old climbing gear, clothes from different decades. These things had been hunting here for years, and some of them were still alive. "Help, please," a weak voice called out. It was Lisa, one of the missing Cavers, wrapped in some kind of clear, sticky web. Her face was pale, but she was alive. We rushed to her, trying to cut her free. That's when she screamed, "Behind you!" I spun around just as one of the creatures dropped from the ceiling. In the light, I could see every horrible detail. Its skin was like wet paper, and you could see its bones moving underneath. Its claws were covered in some kind of slime. Jack raised his pickaxe, but the creature was too quick. It made that terrible sound again, and Jack stumbled, disoriented. Then it happened so fast, the creature's claws slashed out. I'll never forget Jack's scream. "No!" I yelled, swinging my light at the creature. It hissed and backed away. They didn't like bright light, I realized. But there was so much blood. Jack was. I couldn't help him. More creatures were coming into the chamber. The humming got louder, and my head felt like it was splitting open. Lisa was screaming. I grabbed Jack's backpack, the one with the dynamite we'd brought for emergency cave-ins. "I'm sorry," I whispered to Jack. He looked at me, nodding slightly. He knew. "Run, Bill," he managed to say. Tell people." Those were his last words. I stumbled backward, creatures coming from every direction. Their clicking sounds echoed off the walls, and I could see more victims stirring in their cocoons. These things weren't just killing people. They were keeping them alive, storing them like food. My foot hit something, an old metal tank, probably from some long-ago expedition. An idea hit me, horrible but necessary. I had the dynamite, and if that tank was what I thought it was. But first, I had to get out of that chamber, and the creatures were closing in. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the dynamite. The creatures were everywhere now, on the walls, the ceiling, getting closer. Their humming was so strong I could barely think straight. "Over here, you monsters!" I screamed, waving my light around. I needed them to follow me away from the victims, away from Jack. I ran into a narrow tunnel, the creatures right behind me. My light caught glimpses of their awful pale bodies climbing along the walls. Their clicking sounds bounced off the rocks, coming from all directions. My lungs were burning. I was about 2,000 feet underground now, and the air was getting thin, but I had to keep going. Had to get far enough from the chamber. Then I tripped. I fell hard, and my main light broke. In the dim glow of my backup light, I saw what had made me fall, a human skull, picked clean. That's when I knew I'd never make it back to the surface. But maybe I could stop these things from killing anyone else. I pulled out the dynamite with trembling hands. The creatures were closing in, but moving slower now, like they knew they had me trapped. One of them made that terrible sound again, and my vision went blurry. I felt sick to my stomach. Come on," I whispered, trying to light the fuse. My lighter wouldn't work. My hands were too shaky. The closest creature reached out with those horrible long fingers. Finally, the fuse caught. I threw the dynamite toward the old tank I'd spotted earlier and covered my head. The creatures shrieked, a sound like metal scratching glass. The explosion was deafening. The whole cave seemed to shake apart. Rocks started falling everywhere. Something heavy hit my leg. The pain was awful. The creatures screamed even louder as the tunnel started collapsing. I saw them trying to climb away, but the rocks were falling too fast. Their pale bodies were being crushed under the cave-in. I dragged myself backward as fast as I could, rocks falling all around me. My leg was trapped, and I knew what I had to do. Using my pickaxe, I had to free myself. The pain was unbelievable. Somehow I managed to crawl away from the collapse. Everything was quiet now. No more humming, no more clicking. Just the sound of rocks settling and my own ragged breathing. My backup light was fading, but I could see the tunnel behind me was completely sealed off. The creatures were trapped or crushed, but I knew I had to get out, had to warn people. It took me 9 hours to drag myself back to the main cave system, 9 hours of pure hell. When they found me, I was barely conscious. They rushed me to the hospital, where I spent weeks recovering. No one really believed my story at first. They thought the lack of oxygen had made me hallucinate. But they couldn't explain the claw marks all over my body, or what happened to Jack and the others. A week after I got out of the hospital, I went back to the cave with a rescue team. We couldn't get through to the chamber. The cave-in had blocked everything. Maybe that was for the best. But we did find something that made my blood freeze. Near the blocked tunnel, stuck to the wall, was a cluster of strange, translucent eggs, about the size of footballs, with something dark moving inside them. The rescue team wanted to take them for study, but I knew better. I smashed every single one before anyone could stop me. They fired me for that, of course. Said I was unstable, traumatized. Maybe I was. But I knew what I'd seen down there. I still work as a guide for smaller caves now, with my prosthetic leg. Every time I hear about someone going missing in a cave, I get cold sweats. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that humming in my head. The official story is that Jack and the others died in a cave-in. The old chamber and everything in it remains buried under tons of rock. But sometimes I wonder, did I get all those eggs? Are there other chambers, other tunnels we never found? Last week, I read in the newspaper about strange tremors being felt near another cave system in Tennessee. The same kind of tremors we had back then. I should probably tell someone. Warn them. But who would believe an old man with crazy stories about monsters in caves? All I know is this. If you're ever deep in a cave and you hear a strange humming sound or something that sounds like clicking, don't stop to figure out what it is. Run. Run as fast as you can, because the crawlers are real and they're still out there waiting in the dark. My name is Frank Matthews, and this happened to me back in 1977, when I was working as a ranger in the Great Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. I still remember every detail like it was yesterday, though sometimes I wish I could forget. Before becoming a ranger, I was a Marine, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing in my military training could have prepared me for what I encountered in those misty mountains. I was 41 then, living alone in a small cabin near the ranger station with my German shepherd, Duke. He was more than just a pet. He was my partner in all my patrols and searches. Life was simple and peaceful, at least until that fall when everything changed. It started with the fog. Now, fog isn't unusual in the Smokies. It's why they're called the Smoky Mountains after all. But this was different. This fog was thick, like white soup, and it stayed for days, then weeks. It wasn't natural. Even the old-timers who'd lived in these parts their whole lives said they'd never seen anything like it. Looking back now, I should have known something was wrong when the animals started leaving. First, it was the birds, all of them, just gone one morning. Then the deer, then even the bears. It was like they knew something was coming, something that made them so scared they forgot their natural fears and instincts. That was just the beginning of what would become the most terrifying experience of my life. Even now, years later, as I sit here telling this story, I can feel my hands shaking. Because what happened in those mountains didn't just stay there, it changed me forever, in ways I'm still trying to understand. I'm telling this story now because people need to know the truth. They need to know what's out there hiding in the mist. And maybe, just maybe, someone else has seen what I've seen, and I'm not as alone as I think I am. Let me take you back to where it all began, that cold October morning when I first noticed something wasn't quite right in my mountains. It was a Tuesday morning when everything started to feel wrong. I was doing my usual patrol, with Duke trotting ahead of me on the trail. The fog was so thick I could barely see 20 feet ahead. My flashlight beam just bounced off the white wall of mist, making it even harder to see. Duke was acting strange that morning. He kept stopping and growling at nothing, his ears perked up like he was hearing something I couldn't. I'd never seen him act like this before. And trust me, when a dog that brave gets scared, you pay attention. I remember checking my watch. It was 9:30 a.m., but it looked like twilight. The fog shouldn't have been this thick this late in the morning. Something about it felt wrong. It was too still, too quiet. You know how forests usually have some sound, birds chirping, leaves rustling, small animals scurrying around? There was nothing, just silence. Then I found the first weird thing. Right in the middle of the trail was a perfect circle where the ground was frozen solid. It was like someone had taken a giant ice cream scoop and frozen just that one spot. But here's the thing. It was about 50 degrees that morning. Nothing should have been frozen. I knelt down to touch it, and Duke started barking like crazy. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Through the fog, about 30 feet ahead, there was a shape. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, and so skinny it looked like a walking stick figure. But the worst part? I could see right through it, like it was made of the fog itself. I've been in these mountains for years. I know every animal, every shadow, every trick of the light. This wasn't any of those things. And then it moved, not like walking, but like it was floating just above the ground. That's when Duke took off running back toward the ranger station, whimpering like a puppy. I'd like to say I was brave and went to investigate, but 20 years in the Marines taught me one thing. When something feels wrong, it usually is. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the shape until I couldn't see it anymore, then turned and ran after Duke. Back at the ranger station, I tried to write up a report. What do you even say? Saw a ghost in the fog? They'd think I was crazy. So I just wrote about the frozen spot and the unusual silence. But I knew this was just the beginning. Something had changed in my mountains, and deep down, I knew it wasn't going to stop here. That night I couldn't sleep. The fog pressed against my cabin windows like a living thing, and every now and then I swear I could see those tall, thin shapes moving through it. Duke wouldn't stop pacing, and he refused to look out the windows. He knew something was out there, something that shouldn't be. Little did I know, this was just the first sign of the horror that was about to unfold in the Great Smoky Mountains. And those shapes in the fog? They were about to show us exactly what they could do. The next morning, I got a call that would make my blood freeze. 3 hikers had gone missing near Clingman's Dome. Normally, lost hikers aren't too unusual. People wander off trail all the time. But what the search team found made no sense at all. Their tent was still there, sleeping bags neatly laid out. Their breakfast was half-eaten, coffee cups still warm. It was like they'd vanished into thin air in the middle of their morning routine. But that wasn't the scariest part. When Duke and I joined the search, we found something that still haunts my nightmares. About a quarter mile from their camp, we came across some trees that looked wrong. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me in the fog, but as I got closer, I realized what I was seeing was real. There were bodies, or parts of bodies, merged right into the tree trunks, like someone had pushed them halfway through the solid wood and left them there. "Frank, over here," one of the other rangers called out. When I got to where he was, I found something even worse. We found the 3 missing hikers, but they were turned inside out, and somehow, impossibly, they were still alive, still breathing. They couldn't speak, couldn't move, but their eyes were full of terror, like they were seeing something we couldn't. Duke started acting strange again, worse than before. He was spinning in circles, barking at nothing. Then he just stopped. His whole body went stiff, and before I could reach him, he started to swell up like a balloon. I tried to run to him, but the other rangers held me back. It happened so fast. 1 second he was there, and the next, I lost my best friend that day. That's when I saw them again, the tall, skinny figures in the fog. But this time there were more of them, maybe 5 or 6. They moved through trees like they weren't even there. One of them turned its head toward me, and even though it didn't have a face, I knew it was looking right at me. The other rangers couldn't see them. They thought the fog was just playing tricks on us. But I watched as one of these things, these mist walkers, reached out with its long, thin fingers and touched a tree. The tree just opened up like a door. Through that opening, I saw things that shouldn't exist, twisted landscapes and impossible colors. I tried to radio for backup, but all we got was static. The fog had gotten so thick we could barely see each other. That's when I heard the screaming start. Not from our group. These screams were coming from somewhere deep in the forest. They sounded human, but wrong, somehow, like someone screaming underwater. We had to get out of there, fast. But as we started to retreat, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The fog wasn't just following us, it was hurting us. Every time we tried to head back to the ranger station, the mist would thicken until we couldn't see at all, forcing us to change direction. It was pushing us toward the old fire tower, and that's when I realized we weren't the ones doing the hunting. We were being hunted. The old fire tower loomed ahead of us, a dark shape rising up through the fog. By now, there were only 3 of us left me, Tim from the rescue team, and Sarah, a new ranger who just started last month. The others, well, I still hear their screams sometimes in my dreams. As we climbed the rusty metal stairs, each step creaking under our feet, I could see the mist walkers gathering below. They were everywhere now, their tall, thin bodies swaying like trees in a wind that wasn't there. The worst part was watching them pass through solid objects like they were made of smoke. "What are they doing?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. She could see them too now. I guess when they want you to see them, you do. That's when we saw it happening. One of the mist walkers reached into a tree and pulled something out, something red and wet that pulsed in its long fingers. It was a heart, a human heart. And it was still beating. Tim threw up over the railing. I couldn't blame him. We watched in horror as more of them started doing the same thing, reaching through trees, rocks, even the ground itself, pulling out different organs. The worst part was hearing the muffled screams coming from inside the solid objects. These things were harvesting people who were somehow trapped inside, and their victims were still conscious. Up in the tower, we found something that finally explained it all. Carved into the metal walls were symbols I'd never seen before, glowing with a faint blue light. In the center of the room was what looked like a tear in the air itself, a doorway to somewhere else. Through it, I could see a world of gray mist and floating shapes, where these things came from. "They're using our world like a farm," I said, the horrible truth hitting me. "They're farming us." The mist walkers were getting closer, climbing up the tower now, passing through the metal like it was nothing. We were trapped. Sarah was crying, Tim was praying, and I knew what I had to do. I'd noticed something earlier. These things couldn't pass through living tissue as easily as they did through dead matter. That's why they had to make those doorways to harvest organs. And that doorway in the tower, it was their way home. I looked at my left arm, then at the glowing symbols around the doorway. Maybe, just maybe, living flesh could disrupt whatever power was keeping that door open. "When I say run, you run," I told Sarah and Tim. "Don't look back, don't stop, just run." Before they could stop me, I shoved my left arm right into the center of that doorway. The pain was. I can't even describe it. It felt like my arm was being torn apart and put back together 1,000 times a second. The mist walkers started shrieking, a sound like metal scraping on metal. The last thing I remember before passing out was seeing the doorway starting to close and the mist walkers being pulled back through it like leaves in a whirlwind. My arm, well, it was a small price to pay for closing that door. But the story doesn't end there, because ever since that day I've been different. The fog might be gone, but I can still see them sometimes, the mist walkers. They're still out there, in other places, making other doors. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel my missing arm trying to warn me when they're near. It's been 47 years since that day in the fire tower. I'm an old man now, retired from the ranger service, living in a small house far from the mountains. But what happened there never really left me. The doctors said I was lucky to survive. They couldn't explain what happened to my arm. There wasn't any blood, no torn flesh. It was just gone, like it had never been there at all. Sarah and Tim made it out too, but they left Tennessee and never came back. I don't blame them. The official report said it was mass hysteria caused by some kind of gas leak in the mountains. They said the fog was just a weird weather pattern. They had explanations for everything, except the missing people, the half-merged bodies that disappeared before they could be photographed, and my missing arm. But here's the thing about surviving something like that. It changes the way you see the world. Literally, in my case. Ever since that day, I've been able to see things others can't. I'll be walking down a busy street and spot one of them, a mist walker, sliding between people who have no idea what's passing right through them. I'll see their doorways sometimes, shimming in the air like heat waves on hot pavement. The phantom pain in my missing arm acts like an alarm now. It starts tingling whenever they're near, burning when they're about to open a doorway. I've learned to use it as a warning system. Sometimes I can even warn people to stay away from certain places, though they usually think I'm just a crazy old man. Last week, I felt it again, that familiar burning sensation where my arm used to be. I was at the grocery store when I saw one of them, taller than the rest, standing in the frozen food section. It turned its head toward me, and for the first time in all these years, I swear it nodded at me, like it was acknowledging me, like it knew what I'd done. That's why I'm telling this story now, because they're getting bolder. The fog that used to hide them, they don't seem to need it anymore. They're learning, adapting, and I'm afraid. I'm afraid they're planning something bigger. To anyone reading this, if you ever find yourself in a place where the air feels wrong, where silence falls too suddenly, where the mist moves against the wind, run as fast as you can. And if you see something tall and thin from the corner of your eye, something that shouldn't be there, don't look directly at it. Because once they know you can see them, they never stop watching you back. I lost my arm closing one doorway, but there are more out there. Sometimes at night I lie awake wondering, what happens when they find a way to open them all at once? What happens when the walls between our world and theirs get too thin to hold? All I know is this. Every time my missing arm starts to burn, somewhere in the world, another person vanishes without a trace. And there's nothing I can do about it except remember and warn others and hope that someday someone finds a way to stop them for good. Because the mist walkers are still here, they're still harvesting, and they're getting hungry again. My name is Marcus Rodriguez, and this happened to me in the summer of 1983. I was 39 then, working as a wildlife expert in the Everglades National Park in Florida. That summer was different from any other I'd experienced in my 15 years at the park. The heat was unbearable, the kind that makes your clothes stick to your skin and turns the air into a thick, wet blanket. I remember sitting in my small office at the ranger station, wiping sweat from my forehead for the 100th time that day, when the first strange report came in. Usually, I dealt with regular park issues, lost tourists, alligator sightings, or the occasional snake problem. But this was something else entirely. It started with a deer. A park visitor found it lying in a clearing, still breathing, but wrong. When we got there, the deer was alive, but it was like a deflated balloon. Its skin was intact, but something had taken every single bone from inside its body. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. I'd seen a lot of weird things in my years at the park, but nothing like this. Then more reports started coming in. A wild boar, 3 raccoons, even a full-grown panther, all found alive but boneless. Like something had reached inside them and pulled out their skeletons without leaving a mark on their skin. The higher-ups thought it might be some new disease, or maybe a crazy person playing sick pranks. But I knew better. In all my years studying wildlife, I'd never heard of anything that could do something like this. That's when they assigned me to investigate. They gave me a partner too, Tom Collins, a younger ranger who'd been with us for about 2 years. He was eager, maybe too eager. Neither of us knew then that we were about to face something that would change our lives forever, something that shouldn't exist in our world. If I'd known what was waiting for us in those swamps, would I have still gone looking for it? I ask myself that question every night when I look at the strange bumps growing in my arm. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you the whole story, exactly as it happened, during that horrible summer in the Everglades. I should warn you, though, what you're about to hear isn't easy to stomach. Some nights, I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering what I saw in those dark waters. But you deserve to know the truth about what's out there, about what we found in the cypress swamp, and about the thing we came to call the Bone Taker. It all started getting really weird on a Tuesday morning. Tom and I were checking out another report, this time about a bunch of dead fish floating in one of the smaller ponds. But when we got there, something felt off. The fish weren't dead. They were just floating there, moving slightly, like jelly in water. When I picked one up, it felt wrong in my hands, soft and floppy, like a wet sock. "Marcus, look at this," Tom called out, his voice shaking a bit. He was holding up an X-ray we'd taken of one of the fish. There wasn't a single bone inside it, not one. It was like someone had carefully pulled out every tiny bone without leaving a mark. That same afternoon, we got another call. This time it was from Betty, an old lady who lived on the edge of the park. She said her dog was acting strange. When we got to her house, I'll never forget what we saw. Her German Shepherd was lying on the porch, breathing, but flat, like a furry pancake. The poor thing was still wagging its tail, but it couldn't stand up. We started marking every spot where we found these boneless creatures on a map. At first, the marks seemed random, but after a week, we noticed something. All the incidents were moving in a pattern, like something was making its way through the park, heading toward the old cypress swamp. One evening, as the sun was setting, Tom and I were walking back to our truck after checking another site. That's when we heard it, a sound I can't really describe. Like someone dragging wet fingers across glass, but deeper, coming from somewhere in the trees. We froze. The air got colder, even though it was still summer. Then we saw something move between the trees. It wasn't like any animal I knew. It was like watching water move, but standing up and inside it. I could see bones floating around, clicking together. Tom grabbed my arm. "Marcus," he whispered, "we need to go, now." But before we could move, we heard screaming. It was coming from the direction of the ranger station. 4 of our fellow rangers were on duty that night. We ran as fast as we could, but by the time we got there, I still have nightmares about what we found. The station was empty, but there were puddles. Puddles that used to be people. And in the middle of the room, standing like some horrible statue, was a skeleton made from different bones put together all wrong. That's when we knew we weren't dealing with some disease or crazy person. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist, and it was getting stronger with every bone it took. Tom looked at me, his face pale in the emergency lights. "What do we do now?" I wish I'd known then what I know now. I wish I'd told him to run, to get as far away from the Everglades as he could. But instead I said, "We need to find where it's taking them." Little did I know, that decision would lead us to something even more horrifying, something that still haunts me to this day. The next morning, Tom and I started tracking this thing deeper into the swamp. The air was thick and muggy, and every splash in the water made us jump. We followed a trail of half-dead creatures, birds that couldn't fly, snakes that just lay there like ropes, all of them alive but empty inside. I noticed Tom was acting strange. He kept rubbing his arm and looking over his shoulder. "You okay?" I asked him. He nodded, but I could tell something was wrong. His face was pale, and he was sweating more than the heat called for. Around noon, we found something that made my blood run cold. Hidden behind a wall of cypress trees was an old wooden shack, tilting to one side like it was melting in the heat. But it wasn't the shack that scared us. It was the sounds coming from inside. Soft moaning, like a hospital ward. "We should call for backup," Tom whispered. But our radios hadn't worked for the past hour. We were on our own. When we pushed open that creaky door, I saw something I'll never forget. The shack was bigger on the inside than it looked, and it was full of bodies. Not dead ones, living people and animals, all of them boneless, piled on top of each other like wet blankets. They were breathing, moving slightly, their eyes following us as we entered. Some of them I recognized hikers who'd been reported missing over the past few weeks. They're being kept alive," Tom said, his voice shaking. Like a farm." That's when we heard it, that wet, sliding sound again. But this time it was behind us. I turned around just in time to see Tom's eyes go wide. Something was moving through him, like clear glass through water. He didn't scream. He couldn't. I watched in horror as his bones began to slide out of his body, one by one. "Run, Marcus," he managed to say, before he collapsed. But I couldn't run. I couldn't leave him there. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, the thing we'd been hunting. It was standing there, building itself a new body from Tom's bones and all the others it had collected. It looked like a twisted sculpture made of different-sized bones, stuck together all wrong. I backed away, my foot hitting something solid. It was an old metal container. Through my terror, I remembered something. The acid we used to clean the boats. The container was full of it. The bone creature turned toward me, moving in a way that nothing should move. It reached out with arms made of mixed-up bones, and I could see Tom's skull now sitting on top of its horrible body, his jaw moving up and down like it was trying to speak. I knew I had only one chance. But what happened next? Well, that's the part that still keeps me awake at night. I grabbed the container of acid with shaking hands. The bone creature was getting closer, making that horrible wet sound. Tom's skull was staring at me, his jaw still moving like a puppet's. I knew my friend was in there somewhere, trapped. "I'm sorry, Tom," I whispered, and threw the acid. The creature let out a sound I'll never forget, like 1,000 pieces of chalk scratching on a blackboard. The acid hit it right in the center, and the bones began to melt. They sizzled and smoked, turning into goo. The thing tried to hold itself together, but it was falling apart, bones dropping everywhere. But something went wrong. As it melted, the creature started thrashing around, knocking over more containers of acid. The whole shack started to fill with smoke. The boneless people were crying out, unable to move themselves. I had to get them out. I ran from person to person, dragging them to safety. My lungs were burning from the acid smoke, but I couldn't stop. I managed to save most of them, including Tom. When I finally pulled him out, he was like a heavy water balloon. But he was alive. The shack collapsed behind us, and with it, that bone monster melted away into nothing, or so I thought. The rescue teams found us an hour later. They took everyone to the hospital. The doctors couldn't explain how people were living without bones, but slowly, over months, their skeletons grew back. It was like their bodies somehow remembered what they were supposed to be. Tom recovered too, but he never came back to work. He moved away from Florida, and I don't blame him. Some things you just can't forget. I thought it was over. I really did. But 3 months later, I noticed something strange on my arm. Tiny bumps under the skin, hard like pebbles. X-rays showed they were growing bones, but not normal ones. They were twisted, like the ones the creature had used. Sometimes at night, I feel them moving, growing. The doctors want to remove them, but I won't let them. You see, I need to keep an eye on these bones, because I know something nobody else does. That thing in the swamp, it didn't die. It just changed. And a small piece of it is inside me now, waiting. Every time I go near the swamp, these bone fragments in my arm start to tingle. It's like they're trying to tell me something, like they're trying to go home. And sometimes, on really quiet nights, I can hear that wet, sliding sound again, coming from deep in the Everglades. So if you're ever in the Florida swamps, and you feel a cold spot on a hot day, or hear something that sounds like water moving in a way it shouldn't, run. Run as fast as you can. Because the bone taker is still out there, and it's still hungry. And now, it knows what we taste like. That was 40 years ago. I still work at the park, but now I'm behind a desk, training new rangers. Most folks think I'm just a crazy old man with wild stories. But every now and then, something happens that makes me think it's starting again. Last week, a young ranger found a deer alive but boneless, just like before. Nobody wanted to believe it, but I saw the fear in their eyes. They remembered the old stories. The bumps in my arm have grown bigger over the years. Sometimes they form patterns, like they're trying to spell something out. My doctor says it's just calcium deposits, but I know better. They get warm whenever I'm near the old cypress swamp, like they're saying hello to something out there. I keep a bottle of acid in my truck now, just in case. The other rangers laugh about it, but they don't laugh too hard. They've all heard the sounds at night, that wet sliding noise that doesn't belong in nature. Yesterday, I got a letter from Tom. First one in years. All it said was, "They're growing in me too, Marcus, and they're spreading." I looked at my arm after reading that. The bumps had shifted again, forming what looked like a tiny skeleton under my skin, and for just a second, I swear I saw it move. So here's my warning to anyone who comes to the Everglades. If you're walking in the swamp and suddenly feel cold on a hot day, if you see something moving that looks like clear glass and water, or if you hear bones clicking together when there's no one else around, don't run. Running makes it excited. Just back away slowly and pray it hasn't noticed you. Because the bone taker isn't gone. It's just waiting, growing, learning. And sometimes late at night, when I look at the bumps in my arm, I wonder if it left pieces of itself in all of us survivors on purpose, like seeds waiting to grow. Maybe that's why Tom wrote to me. Maybe he knows what I know, that one day those bone fragments inside us will want to go home. And when that day comes, the bone taker won't need to hunt anymore. It'll already be inside all of us. My name is Thomas Walker, and this happened to me back in 1991 when I was working as a ranger in Redwood National Forest. I was 44 then, and after spending 15 years in these woods, I thought I knew everything there was to know about these ancient giants. But I was wrong. So terribly wrong. Let me tell you about the winter that changed my life forever. A winter when I discovered something beneath these majestic trees that should have stayed buried. Something that still haunts my dreams and lives inside my blood. I remember it started with the trees. The mighty redwoods that had stood tall for thousands of years began showing signs of something I'd never seen before. Their roots were dying, but not in any way I'd seen in my years as a ranger. It wasn't like normal root rot or disease. No, this was different. The roots weren't just dying, they were being consumed by something. At first, I thought it was just another forest problem we'd have to deal with. You know, the usual stuff, maybe a new fungus or some soil issue. I'd dealt with plenty of those over the years. But then the sinkholes started appearing. Huge holes in the ground, appearing overnight as if the earth itself was being swallowed up. I can still feel the chill that ran down my spine when I first shined my flashlight down one of those holes. The beam disappeared into darkness that seemed to go on forever. And somewhere in that darkness, something was waiting, something that would soon turn my world into a nightmare. But before I tell you what I found down there, you need to understand exactly how it all started. Because what happened in those woods wasn't just scary, it was the kind of thing that makes you question everything you think you know about nature, about life itself, and about what might be sleeping beneath our feet. Let me start from the beginning, from that first cold morning when everything seemed normal, but nothing would ever be normal again. It was early December, and the morning started like any other. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on the trees near Tall Creek. That's what we called the stream that ran through the oldest part of the forest. The air was crisp, and my breath came out in little white puffs. Something felt off that morning, though. The forest was too quiet. Usually, you'd hear birds singing, squirrels chattering, but that day, nothing. I noticed it first near Old Gloria, our biggest redwood tree. The ground around it felt spongy, like walking on a wet mattress. When I knelt down to check, I saw the soil was darker than usual, and there was this strange smell, kind of like wet mushrooms, but worse, much worse. "Hey, Walker." That was Mike, one of my younger rangers, running toward me. His face was pale. "You need to see this, over by Section C." I followed him through the misty forest. The closer we got to Section C, the stronger that weird smell became. Then I saw it, a hole in the ground, perfectly round, about 15 feet wide. It hadn't been there yesterday. I'm sure of it because I'd walked this exact path the day before. "That's not the only one," Mike said, his voice shaking a bit. "We found 3 more just like it." I took out my flashlight and aimed it down the hole. The beam disappeared into nothing. I picked up a small rock and dropped it in. We waited and waited. No sound came back. "Something's killing the roots," I said, pointing to the edges of the hole. The tree roots there were black and mushy, like they'd been dissolved by acid. But it wasn't just the roots. The soil around them had these tiny white threads running through it, like spider webs, but they seemed to pulse slightly in the morning light. I'd seen a lot of strange things in my years as a ranger, but this was different. My gut was screaming at me that we'd stumbled onto something dangerous, really dangerous. "Mike, I want you to call headquarters. Tell them we need a team out here." And I paused, seeing something move in the corner of my eye. Those white threads in the soil, they were spreading, right there in front of us, like they were alive. "And what?" Mike asked. "Tell them to bring hazmat suits. Whatever this is, we shouldn't touch it." Little did I know we were already too late. Those white threads weren't just in the soil. They were reaching out, spreading, searching. And soon, they would find exactly what they were looking for: us. That night I couldn't sleep. The forest had always been my home, my safe place. But now it felt like something was watching, waiting. And in the darkness, I could swear I heard something moving deep beneath the earth. The next morning, our team arrived. Dr. Sarah Chen, a plant scientist, and 2 other rangers, Jack and Pete. We all stood there, staring at those holes that had somehow gotten bigger overnight. The weird thing was, more of those white threads had spread everywhere, like a giant spider had been busy all night. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Chen said, taking samples in little plastic bags. She was wearing a white hazmat suit that made her look like an astronaut. "These aren't normal fungal growths. They seem to be communicating somehow." That's when we heard it. A sound that still gives me nightmares. Like a whisper, but not quite human. It came from one of the holes. "Help! Please help!" Pete stepped closer to the hole. "Did you hear that? Sounds like someone's down there." "Pete, wait!" I grabbed his arm. Something wasn't right. The voice. It sounded familiar, but wrong, like when you play a record too slow. But Pete pulled away. He was young, eager to help. "We can't just leave someone down there." Before I could stop him, he was shining his flashlight down the hole. The beam caught something moving in the darkness, something white and stringy, like those threads in the soil, but bigger. Much bigger. "Oh God," Pete whispered. Then he screamed. The threads shot up from the hole like lightning. They wrapped around Pete's legs before any of us could react. I grabbed him, tried to pull him back, but those things were strong. So strong. "Help me!" Pete yelled. His voice was real this time, full of terror. Jack and I held on to him, pulling with all our might, but it was like fighting against a truck. Dr. Chen ran forward with a flamethrower we'd brought just in case. The flames hit the white threads, and they released Pete with a horrible shrieking sound. He fell backward, shaking all over. But something was wrong with his legs where those things had touched him. Through his torn pants, we could see patches of white, like mold, spreading across his skin. "It burns," Pete whimpered. "It burns so bad." We rushed him to the emergency medical tent we'd set up. Dr. Chen tried everything she could think of, antibiotics, antifungal medications, even burning the infected areas. Nothing worked. The white patches kept spreading. And then Pete started talking in that same wrong voice we'd heard from the hole. "Join us," he said. But it wasn't really him anymore. "Come down. See what we've found." That's when we realized we weren't just dealing with some strange forest disease. Whatever was down there in those holes, it was alive, it was smart, and it was using Pete to call to us. We had to sedate him. As he was passing out, he grabbed my arm, and for just a moment, his eyes were clear. "Kill me," he whispered in his real voice. "Please, Walker, don't let me become one of them." But it was already too late. By nightfall, Pete had disappeared from the medical tent. We found his tracks leading straight to the biggest hole. And, down in the darkness, we could hear him calling to us, his voice mixing with others. So many others, we had no choice but to go down there. We needed to find Pete, and we needed to understand what we were dealing with. The next morning, Jack, Dr. Chen, and I put on our hazmat suits and prepared to enter the largest hole. Mike stayed up top to coordinate with headquarters. "Remember," Dr. Chen said, checking our radio equipment, "don't touch anything. Not the walls, not the ground, nothing." We lowered ourselves down with ropes. The hole went deep, maybe 100 feet down. Our flashlights showed tunnel walls covered in those white threads, but now they were as thick as ropes. They pulsed with a faint light, like they had their own heartbeat. The tunnel at the bottom wasn't natural. It was perfectly round, like something had eaten through the earth. The air was thick and wet, smelling like rotting mushrooms and something else, something worse. "Walker," Jack whispered, pointing ahead. "Look." Our lights showed something that made my blood freeze. The tunnel opened into a massive cave, and inside were the missing people. Not just Pete, but hikers who had disappeared over the past months. They were standing there, swaying slightly, with white threads growing out of their skin. Their eyes were milky white. But the worst part was the giant mass in the center of the cave. It was like a huge brain made of fungus, glowing with a sickly white light. Those rope-like threads connected to it from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, and from each person in the room. "It's using the tree roots," Dr. Chen said, her voice shaking. "It's connected to the entire forest, the redwoods. They're like its nervous system." Then Pete turned to look at us. But it wasn't Pete anymore. His face was covered in white growths, and when he spoke, other voices spoke with him. "We've been waiting so long," the voices said through Pete. "So long in the dark. Now we can finally spread, finally grow. Join us, Thomas Walker. Be part of something greater." All the infected people started moving toward us. Their movements were wrong, like puppets on strings. Jack panicked and ran back toward the tunnel, but he tripped, and his hazmat suit tore on a sharp rock. The white thread shot out instantly, touching his exposed skin. Jack screamed as the infection spread across his face in seconds. Dr. Chen and I ran, but we could hear them all following us. Their footsteps echoed in the tunnel, and their voices, so many voices, called out to us. We barely made it to the ropes. As we climbed up, I looked down one last time. Jack was there now, standing with the others, his face already white with fungus. They all stared up at us with those milky eyes, swaying together like plants in a breeze. When we reached the top, Dr. Chen was crying inside her hazmat suit. "We have to stop it," she said. "If this thing spreads beyond the forest—" I nodded. I knew what we had to do. But looking at the forest around us, seeing those threads spreading through the soil everywhere, I realized just how big this task would be. And somewhere below, that thing was growing, spreading, waiting. We had one chance to stop this thing, Dr. Chen figured out that the creature was most vulnerable at its heart, that huge fungal brain we saw in the cave. But to reach it, we'd have to go through all those infected people, including our friends. "Fire," Dr. Chen said, mixing chemicals in the emergency tent. "It's afraid of fire. But regular flames aren't enough. We need something stronger." She was making a special kind of fuel, napalm. It would burn hot enough to destroy the entire root system, but someone would have to carry it down there. That night we heard more voices calling from the holes, not just Pete and Jack now, but Mike too. He'd disappeared during his watch. The infection was spreading faster, and the holes were getting bigger. "I'll go," I said. "I know these woods better than anyone." Dr. Chen shook her head. "It's suicide, Walker. We don't have a choice." I put on the last good hazmat suit and filled a backpack with napalm containers. As I stood at the edge of the biggest hole, I could see the white threads glowing below, pulsing like they were inviting me down. The climb down was the scariest thing I'd ever done. This time, the tunnel was full of infected people. They just stood there, watching me with those white eyes. But they didn't attack. They wanted me to reach the center. The creature wanted me. In the main cave, the fungal brain had grown twice as big. The white threads were everywhere now, thick as tree trunks. And there, standing around it, were all my friends, Pete, Jack, Mike, and at least 20 other people, all connected to the creature by glowing threads. "Welcome," they all said together. "Join us in the deep. Be part of forever." I felt something pushing at my mind, like fingers trying to get in. The creature was trying to control me, even through my hazmat suit. My hands started shaking as I reached for the napalm. "Walker," Pete's real voice broke through, just for a second. "Do it, please." I started pouring the napalm. The infected people moved toward me, but slowly, like they were fighting against themselves. Some part of them was still in there, still fighting. Just as I was about to light the match, a thread caught my arm. My suit had a small tear I hadn't noticed. I felt a burning sensation as the infection started spreading up my arm. But that was exactly what I needed. As I felt the creature trying to take over my mind, I fought back with everything I had, just long enough to light the match. The napalm caught immediately. The fire spread faster than anything I've ever seen, racing along all those threads like they were fuses. The fungal brain burst into flames, and the screaming. The screaming was like 1,000 voices all at once. I ran. I don't remember much about getting out, just fire and heat and screaming. When I finally reached the surface, the ground was shaking. The whole forest seemed to be screaming as the fire spread through the root system. That was 3 years ago. The official story is that there was an underground gas leak that caught fire. They say the missing people were lost in hiking accidents. Nobody wants to believe what really happened. The forest recovered mostly. New trees grew where the old ones burned. But sometimes, when I walk through those woods at night, I see tiny white threads in the soil, glowing faintly. And I know it's not over. You see, I never told anyone the worst part. The infection that started spreading up my arm that day? The doctors couldn't find anything wrong with me, but I know it's still there. Sometimes, late at night, I feel it moving under my skin, and in my dreams I hear those voices calling to me, telling me to come back to the deep. Dr. Chen checks my blood every month. Last week she found something strange, dormant spores, thousands of them, just waiting for the right moment to wake up. I can feel them now, as I tell you this story. They're getting stronger. That's why I had to tell someone what really happened, because I don't know how much longer I can fight them. And sometimes when I'm walking in the woods, I catch myself stopping near the old burned areas. My hand reaches down toward the soil, almost touching it, like something inside me wants to reconnect, to go back to that thing in the deep. But the scariest part, the part that keeps me awake at night, I'm starting to want to. My name is Richard Cooper, but everyone calls me Rick. This happened to me back in 1997, and even now, at the age of 75, my hands shake when I think about it. I've spent most of my life teaching people how to survive in the desert, Death Valley to be exact. 26 years in the business, and I thought I'd seen everything the desert could throw at me. But that summer changed everything I knew about darkness and fear. I remember it was a beautiful time of year for stargazing. The Perseid meteor shower was coming up, and tourists were flocking to Death Valley National Park to watch the light show. The days were scorching hot, like always, but the nights were different. Something felt wrong about them, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. It started with the missing animals. First, it was just a few kangaroo rats and desert foxes, the kind of creatures that come out at night. No big deal, I thought. That's just nature doing its thing. But then more animals started disappearing. Not just one or two, but whole groups of them. The strange part? No traces, no blood, no signs of struggle. They just vanished into thin air. The park rangers called me in because of my experience. "Rick," they said, "something's not right out there." They knew I could track anything in the desert, read the sand like a book. But this time, even I was stumped. The tracks would just stop, like the animals had been plucked right off the ground. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of the most terrifying experience of my life. What I was about to discover in Death Valley would make me question everything I thought I knew about darkness, and leave me sleeping with the lights on for the rest of my life. I decided to investigate these disappearances myself. One hot evening in July, I packed my usual gear, flashlights, water bottles, emergency radio, and my trusty camera. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in beautiful oranges and purples. But something felt different that evening. The air felt heavier, like right before a storm. Except there wasn't a cloud in sight. I set up my base camp near a spot where most animals had vanished. As darkness fell, I noticed something odd. The usual desert sounds were missing. No crickets chirping, no coyotes howling in the distance. Just complete silence. In all my years in Death Valley, I'd never experienced such quietness. It felt wrong, like the whole desert was holding its breath. Around midnight, my flashlight caught something strange. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, but shadows don't move against the wind. And this was different. It looked like a patch of darkness darker than the night itself. When I tried to shine my light directly at it, the beam seemed to bend around it, like the darkness was eating the light. I radioed back to base camp. "This is Rick. I'm seeing something unusual out here. Over." The radio crackled with static before a voice responded. "Copy that, Rick. What kind of unusual? Over." Before I could answer, my flashlight flickered and died. Then my backup light did the same. Even the stars above seemed to fade away, leaving me in a darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. That's when I heard it. A sound like wind rushing through a tunnel, but there was no wind. And underneath that sound was something else, something that made my skin crawl. It sounded like whispers, hundreds of whispers, but in a language I'd never heard before. I've been scared before, but this was different. This was pure, raw fear that made my legs feel like jelly. I fumbled for my radio again, but it was dead too. Everything electronic had just stopped working. I knew I had to get out of there, but in that absolute darkness, I had no idea which way was which. And worse, I had the terrible feeling that something was watching me, something that was very, very hungry. I managed to stumble back to base camp that night, though I'm still not sure how. The next morning, I called in a team of experts: Dr. Sarah Chen, a physicist who studied light and darkness; Tom Martinez, another survival expert like me; James Wilson, who knew all about desert animals. I needed help to figure out what was happening. We set up cameras and special equipment all around the area. Sarah brought some fancy light meters that could measure even the tiniest bit of light. For 3 days, everything was normal. But on the 4th night, it happened again. We were all sitting around our monitoring equipment when the computers started going crazy. The temperature dropped suddenly, like someone had opened a freezer door in the middle of the desert. Then our lights started flickering, just like before. "Everyone, stay close," I warned, but it was too late. That unnatural darkness started creeping in from all sides. Tom was the first to notice something terrifying. Our flashlight beams were getting shorter, like the darkness was eating them up. "Look," Sarah pointed at her light meter. "This is impossible. It's showing negative readings. Darkness isn't supposed to be measurable like this." Then we heard the screaming. It was James. He had wandered just a few feet away from our group, but in that thick darkness, he might as well have been miles away. His screams. They weren't just scared screams. They were the sounds of someone facing their worst nightmares. "James!" Tom shouted, moving toward the sound. "Don't move! We're coming!" But when we got to where James should have been, he wasn't there. Just empty space and that suffocating darkness. The whispers started again, louder this time, almost like they were laughing at us. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it hurt. "Rick," she whispered, "look up." Above us, where the stars should have been, was something that still haunts my dreams. It looked like a hole in reality itself, a moving patch of darkness that seemed to go on forever. And in that darkness, I swear I could see faces, hundreds of terrified faces, silently screaming. After losing James, things got worse quickly. Tom started acting strange, jumping at shadows, talking to himself, and drawing weird symbols in the sand. Sarah spent all her time looking through her data, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. But I could see the fear eating away at both of them. One evening, Tom came running into my tent, his eyes wild with panic. "I figured it out, Rick," he said, his hands shaking. "It's not just taking them, it's feeding on their fear. The darkness. It makes you see things, terrible things, before it takes you." Before I could calm him down, he ran out into the night. We found his flashlight the next morning, but Tom was gone. Just like James. Just like all those animals. Sarah's research finally gave us a clue. She discovered that this thing, whatever it was, couldn't handle strong light. It wasn't just any light. It had to be a specific kind. She started working on what she called a light weapon, using some special military-grade equipment she'd called in. "The solar eclipse is coming in 3 days," Sarah told me, her voice trembling. "If this thing is connected to darkness like I think it is, it's going to be stronger than ever during the eclipse. We have to stop it before then." But we were running out of time. That night, I heard Sarah screaming from her lab tent. When I got there, the darkness was already inside, swirling around her like black smoke. She managed to toss me her light weapon before the darkness swallowed her whole. "Use it during the eclipse." Those were her last words before she vanished. I was alone now. Just me, Sarah's weapon, and a creature that fed on darkness and fear. The eclipse was tomorrow, and I knew this would be my only chance to end this nightmare. The day of the eclipse arrived. My hands were shaking as I checked Sarah's light weapon one last time. It looked like a big flashlight, but inside it had special crystals and mirrors that Sarah had designed. I knew I had only one shot at this. As the eclipse started, the desert grew darker and colder. The darkness came faster this time, more confident, like it knew it was stronger. I could feel it surrounding me, trying to show me my worst fears. I saw things, terrible things. Faces of everyone it had taken, including Sarah and Tom, all screaming silently in the dark. "Come on," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Come and get me." That's when I saw it properly for the first time. The creature wasn't just darkness. It was like a tear in the sky, a moving hole that seemed to go on forever. And inside that hole, I could see what looked like another world, a place of endless night where all its victims were trapped. The whispers started again, but this time I could almost understand them. They were promises of fear, of endless terror, of joining all the others in that dark place. The creature moved closer, confident that it had won. But I had been waiting for this moment. Just as the eclipse reached totality, when the sun was completely covered, I pressed the button on Sarah's weapon. A beam of pure white light shot out, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. The creature made a sound I'll never forget, like 1,000 screams mixed with the howl of a winter storm. The light hit the darkness, and for a moment, everything stopped. Then the tear in the sky started to shrink. As it did, I saw something amazing. People were falling out of it. James, Tom, Sarah, and others I didn't recognize, all dropping onto the desert sand. Even the missing animals came tumbling out, alive but scared. The creature tried to fight back, but Sarah's weapon was too strong. With a final shriek that shook the ground, the tear closed completely, and the unnatural darkness vanished. The eclipse ended, and the sun came back. Everyone who fell out of that dark place was alive, but they were different. James couldn't speak for weeks. Tom kept checking every shadow, jumping at the smallest noise. Sarah, she spent days writing down everything she could remember about that other dimension, but her hands would shake every time she tried to draw what she saw. The official story? The park rangers said it was mass hysteria caused by heat and dehydration. They explained away the missing animals as normal migration. Nobody wanted to believe what really happened. But we knew the truth. We survivors still meet once a year in Death Valley, at the same spot. We sit together, surrounded by bright lights, and remind ourselves that we made it out. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those whispers again. Sarah's light weapon sits by my bed, always charged, just in case. The thing that scares me most? During our last meeting, Sarah showed us her latest research. She found similar stories from other deserts around the world, places where people vanished during eclipses, where patches of darkness appeared that shouldn't exist. She thinks there might be more of these creatures out there, hiding in the darkest corners of the world, waiting for their chance to feed. I'm an old man now, but I still can't sleep without a light on. Every night, I check all the shadows in my room. And sometimes, when I look up at the stars, I wonder if that tear in the sky is still up there somewhere, hunting in the darkness. You might not believe my story. Most people don't. But next time you're alone in the dark and you feel like something's watching you, remember this. Sometimes the darkness isn't empty. Sometimes it's hungry. And if you ever find yourself in Death Valley during an eclipse, bring a light. Bring lots of lights. Because even though we stopped that creature, I'm not sure we killed it. After all, as long as there's darkness, it has a place to hide.